Seemingly out of nowhere, former second overall pick by the Devils has come out and addressed his situation with New Jersey, and he is not happy. We just talked about him a couple days back in the 2022 NHL redraft video, but it seems like for New Jersey, their future plans might leave Nemec in the dust. So what's going on with this top 2022 draftee, and could it be just like the David Jiricek situation where we see another top defensive prospect traded? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through all the trade scenarios and all the trade rumors, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this as we lead up to the deadline this year. Now, just a couple days back, we saw Simon Nemec interviewed by a Slovak newspaper, and some of the quotes were pretty grueling. Here's the quote here saying, "I can't remember any number 2 draft pick that went to the farm for a 3rd year. It's still too early to request a trade, but if this situation continues, it will have to be addressed." Now, the actual quote wasn't quite as doom and gloom from him, saying it's hard to say, it's still too early to request a trade. If this situation continues, though, it will have to be addressed. But for now, this is how it stands. So it doesn't seem like Nemec is outwardly asking for a trade yet, but it seems like if the situation were to continue, if he were to be stuck in the AHL again for maybe another year, that his frustration might become clear. Interestingly, he also says, "I believe I've proven multiple times that I belong in the NHL, and I just have to wait for another chance to grab it when it comes." This is the quote that I kind of disagree with a little bit more, because in Nemec's case, there's been some pretty clear holes that he's faced in the NHL already, but I can understand the frustration. Obviously, with all the hype around him and how well he's done in the AHL, especially recently, he's somebody that I don't think deserves a shot in the NHL. Is already a bona fide one, though. I'm not sure I quite agree with that one. But Simon Nemec, I think, is a great top prospect, a second overall pick by New Jersey, and even though I was a little bit lower on him in his draft year, having around the 5 range, he was still somebody that I saw as the best defenseman in that draft class, and as you can see, at 6'1", 190 pounds, he's somebody that I think has developed well since his time being drafted. He's come over to North America since then, playing in the AHL over the past few years, and this being his 3rd year in the AHL. He just got a 5-point night, which makes it a lot better for him in 23 games, 5 goals, 11 assists for 16 points. I think he's going to be a very solid, aggressive offense defenseman who can use his awareness well, and he's somebody that I think has had some holes, at least with his skating and his quickness getting back into the play in the NHL level, but I think that will eventually get alleviated a little bit. At this time, though, at 20 years old, I can see why New Jersey, especially a team that wants to contend, isn't playing him everyday minutes in the NHL, especially with the options they have. You look at the Devils' defense already, and this was one of the weaknesses I think that they tried to alleviate in the offseason, and pretty successfully, that right side of the defense. They had already signed Dougie Hamilton in free agency a couple of seasons back, but they also got Jonathan Kovacevic and Brett Pesce, 2 players that have been great for this Devils defense, especially Kovacevic, who has been, in my opinion, one of the most valuable offseason additions this year. He has been critical to this Devils' success and their consistency with just how good he's using his physicality, his skating, and his awareness. He's been such an improved defenseman over what we saw in Montreal last year, and I think it's a big reason why this defense has been pretty solidified. And now it's looking like he especially might get re-signed, with both Dougie Hamilton and Brett Pesce, of course, having their big contracts from free agency. That leaves Kovacevic as a UFA, and as RJ Media goes into, Kovacevic's grit has transformed the Devils' blue line, and GM Tom Fitzgerald is ready to start extension talks. But where does that leave Simon Nemec? And that is the big question now, because if Hamilton is signed long-term, if Pesce is signed long-term, and Kovacevic is signed long-term, there's really no avenue for Nemec to play strong minutes for this Devils team. Really, the only avenue for Nemec to get minutes is if a player like Kovacevic were to get injured or maybe transition onto the left side next year, but with Dylan Siegenthaler there's a little bit of an issue there. And maybe you wait for Dougie Hamilton to start regressing to potentially get those top pair minutes, but how long is that going to take? 3-4 years? I mean, Dougie Hamilton is still a very solid player, even if he's had his defensive issues this season. For Nemec, you're looking at the long-term future, you're looking at the short-term too, and I could be frustrated with what New Jersey has in store, because they have solidified themselves as a contender. They built up that defense to be a contender, and I think that's left Nemec behind. And that's not even counting the only right-handed competition on your same team in Seamus Casey, who at 21 years old is somebody that was also from the 2022 draft, also right-handed, and in ways I think has been maybe a little bit more successful at the NHL level, even if it has been a much shorter stint. In Casey's case, I think he's somebody that absolutely could overpass Nemec if he's not careful about it, and I think he could also be above the depth chart in ways. Even though I think Nemec is still above him, I think it's getting closer every single day, and that's the thing for me, especially in Nemec's case, that would worry me if I was him, is that basically throughout the entire organization, you have complete replacements, and you already have an NHL roster that isn't really built around you, and I could see why he doesn't see much of a future in them, because honestly, I don't think there is. And now, of course, that has sparked up trade rumors. And as Byron Bader mentions, if there's no longer a spot for Nemec on the Devils and they're forced to trade him, they're going to get an absolute crap ton for him. Probably even shore up any weakness they might have. A nice problem to have as well. And I would agree with that. And we're going to go through a few teams here that I think could be really interesting fits for Nemec. Teams that I think could really use him on that right side of the defense going forward, and other teams that I think could really give some valuable assets for New Jersey that could shore up any weakness, especially in the forward group, that they could really have at all. Now, the thing is, for New Jersey, the issues they have are pretty simple. It's not on the goaltending side, especially with how good Jacob Markstrom has been over the last couple months. On the defense, I mean, the reason why they're trading Nemec in the first place is because that defense is already pretty set. So I doubt we'd see many major moves onto that defensive side. Really, the big thing, I think, for New Jersey in a Nemec trade is perfecting that forward group. Adding a top 6 forward, potentially a winger, and hopefully a center as well. I think the center position will be the most important for New Jersey because they could potentially put Jack Hughes on the wing, or if they get multiple centers, they could have Jack Hughes on the wing and have a first-line center there, and potentially a replacement on that third-line center spot. Even with Erik Haula there, he's fine. I think most likely, and we'll get into the mock trades here, I think he's a cap dump for New Jersey, and a pretty obvious one. That top 6 is going to be the thing to prioritize for New Jersey, and we will see that in any Nemec deal. Now, in Nemec's case, I think he still has a lot of value around the league. Still just 20 years old and somebody that in the AHL has done great things. And at the NHL level, even though he's had his defensive lapses here, especially with his pinching and some of the aggression coming back to bite him, I think that's something that will be able to be turned around in the future and will be able to be harnessed. I don't think he'll ever be this amazing defensive player, especially with the backwards getting be a little bit of an issue there. But I think in terms of the offense, the creativity, and on the power play ability, there's a lot to like with Nemec that I think a lot of teams are going to adore. Now, the first team I wanted to mention in a potential Simon Nemec conversation here is the New York Islanders. And I think they're one of the more unlikely teams on this list just because, of course, they're a division rival. But in terms of what the Devils could really use, I think the Islanders have some pretty interesting options here for New Jersey. Now, of course, the big piece I think that will be going to New Jersey is Brock Nelson. He, to me, is one of the most interesting options at this year's deadline, and I think for New Jersey would be an excellent addition onto that center position. Whether they're going to keep Jack Hughes in that first-line center spot or not, having Nelson as a third-line center would not be a bad problem to have. Even though this year, I think he's taken a little bit of a step back in his goal scoring, he's been a pretty consistent guy. 30 goals plus over the last 3 seasons before this one. And I think in New Jersey's system, with a lot more offense to bring, especially on the power play, Nelson is going to be able to feast. He's somebody that can just score in so many different ways, and especially with how much of a tenured player he is, he's exactly the type of veteran I could see New Jersey wanting. I also debated potentially Jean-Gabriel Pageau being a part of this deal, but even though the Devils have quite a bit of deadline cap space, around $5.6 million, I think getting both Nelson and Pageau might be a little bit much, especially for New Jersey's cap hit. And I don't know if New Jersey would want to bring in Pageau, especially since he's more than just a rental. He's somebody that has a couple more years left on his deal after this one, and he's a fine player, 21 points in 41 games. I think New Jersey would love to have him as a third-line center guy, but with that term, I just don't see that happen. My mistakes, actually. He only has $5 million for the next year after this season, so it's not huge long-term commitment, but I think for New Jersey, they might want to go in a different direction after this offseason, so we'll see. Maybe that is a benefit for them, though, if they want to have a solidified third-line center for next year. Pageau could be that type of guy, but we'll have to wait and see. If they don't go with Pageau, I could see Danny Nelson being a part of this deal. I don't think the Devils want to have many picks or prospects a part of a Nemec deal, at least coming back to them, but I think Nelson would be a bit of an exception. He's somebody that was a second rounder by the Islanders back in 2023, and somebody has developed nicely, I think, as this all-around third-line center for the future. You can see if Notre Dame, not the craziest numbers in the world, but they're not especially a great offensive team. And in Nelson's case, as you can see from the World Juniors, he's a very opportunistic guy, working hard, getting the right positions. I think that's something that for New Jersey, especially the size there, could be pretty enticing. Now, we'll be mentioning him a lot in this video, but I think Erik Haula would also have to be a part of a deal going back. Now, there could be a situation where the Islanders retain a bit on Brock Nelson, and maybe that's just it. I mean, for the Devils, they have quite a bit of deadline cap space, but if they don't want to retain, I think Erik Haula could be a piece going back. Not too expensive at $3.1 million, but I think somebody that is just past his time with New Jersey. I mean, this year, 11 points in 42 games. They're not going to be missing him too much. Now, obviously, there'd be more picks and potential players on this deal, but I think in terms of what the Islanders need in the youth going forward, I think Nemec could be a really interesting option. You look at a player like Isaiah George, who's performed quite well up to this point. I think adding more to that would be critical for the Islanders going forward. Nemec would be exactly the type of offensive piece that they could really use, and I could easily see a Mayfield or Pulak type of trade in the offseason that frees up more space for Nemec going forward. Now, going on to the second team I wanted to mention here, and this is a team that doesn't have the problem of being in the same division, so it's a lot more likely we could actually see a trade here. Next up, I got the Seattle Kraken, who I think would be pretty interesting in adding a potential top pair D. Like we mentioned in the mock draft video a few days back, where we had Radimerka as a potential option for Seattle. I think for the Kraken, they have drafted a lot of defensemen over the years, but maybe not a lot that have that top end potential. Riker Evans may be the exception to that, but players like Caden Price, Ty Nelson, they're solid D, but they can fill out more of the bottom to mid pair roles. In the Mets case, I think they could really use a top pair right D for the future, and I think he could easily possess that type of potential. Now, I think the only thing that could hold that back is that they already have Montour, they already have Larson. I think Montour is really the only one that's solidified for the future there for the Kraken, and I think Nets could easily play over Josh Mahora right now if Seattle really wanted to. But I think considering the lack of success this year, I think Seattle should be going in more of a rebuilding direction, and the Mets would be awesome to see there. Now, in terms of players that could be going back to New Jersey, there's some pretty obvious fits. You got Yanni Gourde, I think, as a perfect third-line centerman. The production hasn't been great this year, but you got to think about the playoff clutchness that he's always brought, and the intensity and the work ethic, and also just the playoff experience he has. I think could be really helpful for New Jersey in that third-line center spot and be exactly what they need there. I could also see potentially Yanni Nyman being a part of a deal as a prospect going forward. New Jersey's going to ask for anybody. He's something that's big, has played pretty well in the AHL this year in 36 games, 15 goals, 24 points. And I also think potentially Oliver Bjorkstrand, if we're looking at a potential swap of especially a player like Andre Palat is going to be going back to Seattle, I think Bjorkstrand could be really interesting putting up on that first line. Maybe he ends up going on a left wing. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. I think the only issue is that Bjorkstrand is a right winger. I think they need right wing a little bit less than left wing, but still, I think Bjorkstrand could be a pretty interesting fit. Another player like Gourde that hasn't had the greatest season this year, but still 52 points. At least that's what he's on pace for, 23 goals. You could go a lot worse than him. I think especially with his speed and how consistent he has been, that's somebody that for New Jersey, I think they could really stand to use. Now, really the main issue with New Jersey and the cap dump options they have is the trade protection. Erik Haula was someone we mentioned before. I think Andre Palat, especially if we're going to be dealing with Seattle, is somebody that they would want to have. But I think considering not just the cap hits, especially in Palat's case at $6 million, but also the no move clauses on both Palat and Erik Haula, that's the thing that I think could keep a trade from happening just because of those guys having that trade protection and not wanting to leave New Jersey. That's the only thing that I think could hamper a deal, especially if it were to be Seattle, that's the other team going back. But I do think a Gourde, Bjorkstrand type of package for New Jersey would fill a lot of the weaknesses there. Now, there's a few teams out there that if I was the GM of them, I would absolutely be clamoring to get into Mets, and the team that I think needs him the most going forward might be the Nashville Predators. And in terms of who they could potentially trade, we talked about potentially two centers being involved in a Mets deal. I think Nashville could easily do this. Now, this all depends on New Jersey's appetites for longer term deals, but I think two centers that could easily be going to New Jersey are Ryan O'Reilly and Colton Sissons. And this to me would be interesting. In Ryan O'Reilly's case, he's already fit pretty well on teams like Toronto, who traded for him at the deadline in terms of a versatile role. He's somebody that this year hasn't been putting up the greatest numbers, but still somebody of Ryan O'Reilly's caliber who can bring some of the defensive effort he has and the understanding and the experience, and at a 50-point pace, especially with how solid he's been in the playoffs the last few years. He's somebody that I think could be a pretty big difference maker for New Jersey if they want to have him as that third line center. They could also, of course, bring him up to the second line, maybe Hischier onto the first, and maybe have Colton Sissons as the third line center. Now, he's somebody that dropped off pretty mightily in terms of his offensive impact this year. But last season, 15 goals, 35 points. I thought he was really underrated last season. And if he is able to unlock that for New Jersey, I think it'd be a pretty underrated third line centerman. I think both of these guys could bring some good value to New Jersey if they are to turn it around, but there is risk. Both of these guys have multiple years after this year, and if it doesn't work in New Jersey, you're kind of stuck with both of them. In Ryan O'Reilly's case, though, I think especially he would be somebody that New Jersey would target at $4.5 million. It's not too much of a commitment, and for the experience he has, I think that could really raise New Jersey when the going gets tough. But I just look at that Nashville defense, and they have so much room for Simon Nemec, it's not even funny. And you look at a lot of the defensive prospects, and there are players like Tanner Molendyk who are lefty. So I think they could really use a premier right D defensive prospect in that pool, and Simon Nemec checks that box. I'm just saying for Simon, you go from the AHL to playing first pair minutes, potentially with Roman Josi, and I'm thinking that's an upgrade. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room and maybe the team that's been talked about the most in a potential Simon Nemec trade, and that is the Montreal Canadiens. And here's the thing. I think maybe out of all the teams we mentioned here, Montreal might have the least interest going forward, even if I think they would really stand to benefit from Nemec going forward. You look at that defense, and I think especially on the future side of things, you have David Reinbacher there, of course, coming up as a right defenseman. Nemec would, I think, really perfect that defense, though. I think they could really use another top four puck-moving offensive D. Carrier, I think, could fill that for now, but in the future, we'll have to wait and see on that. But I think Nemec would be perfect for that potential first line spot and maybe we'll see instead Gulli with Nemec and then Hudson with Reinbacher. Maybe you have that as your top 4. I'm just saying, that wouldn't be too bad. And I think they'd also have some players that New Jersey would really like. Jake Evans is somebody that has really raised his stock this year, and of course is in negotiations to re-sign with Montreal. You can see in 44 games, 10 goals, 13 assists for 23 points. He's somebody that's on pace for 43 with the shorthanded ability he's had, with the all-around effort he's brought. I think he would be perfect as that third-line center for New Jersey. I also think David Savard is somebody that could also fit as somebody that New Jersey want to bring as an extra defenseman. I don't know how many minutes he'd play. He'd probably have to play on the lefty if that were to ever happen, but he'd be there in case of an injury. And I think with how consistent he's been for Montreal, I think that's somebody that New Jersey would also like to have as pretty good insurance. Now, there is the potential that Montreal maybe trades more of their picks, but again, this is the New Jersey Devils we're talking about. I don't think they're in the market for picks and even first rounders. They want to get impact players now, and I just don't know how much Montreal is willing to give up those type of guys, especially since I think for New Jersey to want all these NHL players now to sum up the value of Nemec, I think it would pretty much decimate their roster and their chances for the playoffs. And I think for Montreal at this stage, they would say no to that. Maybe that's just my opinion. Now we're going to go into the last team I'll mention here today, and a team that I think could be fascinating in the Nemec sweepstakes, and that is the Vancouver Canucks. This season has not gone well for them in any respects, and I think honestly the writing is on the wall. I think if I was Vancouver, I would retool in almost every single way and focus on next season. And what would do that? Well, getting a player like Simon Nemec, who I think could really fit into that defense. You look at what it is right now in Roenick, Myers, and Desharnais, it's not great. So, especially in Roenick's case, who has declined since that great season last year, that great start. I think in Nemec's case, though, especially with Tom Willander coming up, you could have a Nemec, Willander, and Roenick top 3 going forward, which I think will be pretty fantastic. I think that could shore up a lot of the issues going forward for Vancouver, especially on the defense, and I think could be really interesting. Now, I think Hughes and Willander would probably be the pair, and then you'd have like Susie and Metz or whatever you wanted to do there. But I think the Mets could really fill a hole on that defense that for Vancouver, they don't really have solved coming up. And I think could play NHL minutes next year and be pretty solid at it. Not be amazing, but once he really gets going, being a difference maker for the Canucks and being another puck mover that I think they do need. But who would be going back to New Jersey? Well, I think Brock Boeser would be the player going back. Of course, as a rental, somebody that isn't re-signed for Vancouver long-term, he's somebody that I think could command some pretty hefty dollar amounts. And I think for the Canucks, they might be a team that says no to that. But I think now is the time to get rid of him if you don't think you're going to be able to re-sign him. He's somebody that is on pace for 30 goals, 54 points. Not having as good of a year as he did last season, but that was an extraordinary career season for him. 40 goals last year. Unbelievable. I think he could be get back to that type of level in New Jersey with the playmakers, with the system they have there, and especially how much he would feast on the power play. I think Boeser would be right at home in New Jersey. And this is something, a connection that we've seen for a long time. There's been so many Boeser to Devils rumors over the past few years that it would just be a culmination of all of that. But even though this doesn't solve their center situation, unless it's a Pettersson or Miller, which honestly, I just don't see New Jersey doing, I think Boeser is the next best option there. And if they're really trying to solidify that wing group, Boeser, I think, would make it absolutely perfect. I think New Jersey would still need a centerman. Maybe Pius Suter is the guy going back. That could be an interesting option there. But I think Boeser would be the main prize. And honestly, if there's anybody out there that I think New Jersey could really stand to benefit from, Boeser would be right at the top of that list. And I think it would be a little bit of a waste if we kept this type of guy until he's 23, 24 years old, and then he's finally able to get NHL minutes. I think Nemec is better than that. I think he has proven to be more worthy of an opportunity. And I think in a different team, he will be able to get that. And I think it's just a situation that Seamus Casey might also find himself in, where New Jersey decides to go for the winning now, which I think is a right call. Even though Nemec is awesome, I think for New Jersey's case, a trade is pretty likely to happen here at some point. But those are my thoughts on the Simon Nemec situation. And I want to know down below for you guys if you guys agreed or disagree with that. And some of the teams we talked about, you guys think that we could see a Nemec trade there? Or is there a different team that I didn't talk about that Nemec could be a fit for? Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me see your mock trades as well. Of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you haven't already. And share your video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. And I will see you guys in the next one. Make sure you click on this card as well for all my Trade Rumor content before you go. And goodbye.